Welcome back to the Content That Grows podcast. I'm your host, Nate Turner, and today we're going to be talking about the 11 most common site migration issues. I'm joining today.
Just get the first few, what's it called? Yips out.
It's funny. I've gotten into such a habit of like how I do the intro, and now I'm changing on the fly. All right. Ready? Welcome back to the Content That Grows podcast. I'm your host, Nate Turner. Today, we're going to be talking about the 11 most common site migration issues, and I'm sitting down with my co-founder, Kevin King. How's it going, Kevin?
Pretty good, Nate. How about yourself?
Doing well. Excited to dive in. So the reason we're talking about this today is, we occasionally do site migration audits for clients, and there's a number of things that come up. And so we thought, if you're thinking about doing this, moving from WordPress to Webflow, or WordPress or some Webflow, any other CMS to maybe a headless CMS, or any of those different moves that you might make as a company. There's just a lot of things that can come up along the way. A lot of people tend to believe that as they come in to this project, they're going to see a big loss in traffic and rankings and performance, because that's just part of what happens. And it is quite common, but there are a lot of things you can do to mitigate that and recover very quickly. And so we want to kind of just go through some of the most common things we see. They're not necessarily in order of the most impactful or least impactful, but want to just call that out in case you have a site migration project coming up. May be helpful to you. So Kevin, will get started with number one, which is like an internal redirect chain might get created, or multiple redirect chains might get created.
Yeah, this one's a fun one. Redirect chains, I don't think are as widely unknown or understood or predicted, I guess, ultimately with site migrations. Any technical SEO is going to know if the Screaming Frog crawl, your probably crawler of choice for any type of migration work, they have a report that has redirect chains, but ultimately redirect chains being URLs that have to hop more than one redirect, right, to get to the final destination. And that's like a big no-no for Google crawlers. And it's just from a crawl efficiency standpoint, not great, right? Like the more times it has to hop, the bigger the site, the many more there are, the longer it takes for a crawl to happen. And it just sends weird signals. So you want to catch those and limit them to as few as possible, right? Just one, if anything, or remove the redirect completely and go direct.
Yeah, and that it's less common that's going to happen on a brand new site, that's maybe 6 months old and you're moving to a new platform or whatnot. But when you get into several years old, things have changed several times. You've had product pages, then you've had platform pages, and you've had feature, solution, all these different things that have changed. Maybe the structure of your blog has changed. That's when you get into more issues where some of those past redirects, if you don't go through that as part of it, and really make sure that you're mapping the old redirect to the new URL, that's where you end up with that double hop. Yep. Moving on to number two, no index tags get left on.
Yeah, a big no-no. And also happens quite frequently. It's mainly from staging sites, right? Like a staging site should be set to no index. So, you're playing in your staging environment, getting everything ready. And then ultimately when you make the hop, that gets left on, it gets transferred over to production, and then all of a sudden your site is potentially de-indexed, which is really, really scary. And that means pages are removed from Google SERPs and people can't find you anymore. Probably one of the more extreme issues, or probably most impactful from a negative standpoint, that can happen on a site migration, but it definitely happens pretty frequently.
Yeah, and the sneaky part is when it happens, on a couple pages or one page, or just a small collection. If you saw the whole site was set that way, it'd probably be pretty obvious pretty quickly that there was an issue. But when it's only on a small number of pages, it can kind of go under the radar for a little bit longer as well.
Totally.
All right, number three, the staging site gets indexed.
Yes, basically the other side of that coin. So basically, you have your staging site getting ready to go live, and ultimately the index tag makes its way onto the staging site, even when you flip over to production. So this is usually when you have like two versions of the site that ultimately then are indexed. And it can happen a variety of ways. Maybe you actually only index the staging site and no index production. You index both. So there's some nuance to how it can happen, but ultimately staging site getting indexed is not ideal. Sometimes you can capture some issues there with or prevent them with like proper canonical structure, but it's a rabbit hole to go down. But it's not something you want to see, and we actually see it frequently. We're seeing it more recently with a client as well.
Yep. And so speaking of canonical, if you are changing it for staging or not, or depending on how the prior platform was handling it, may encounter more options. So number 4 is the canonical URL or global canonical setting leads to indexation issues.
Yep. Yeah. Another one we see actually fairly often, and ultimately can make its way into it because, again, if you don't change the canonical structure when you're flipping from staging to production. So a lot of times you already have like the staging URL is self-referencing to staging, just because that's how the site was just deployed when it was first built. And then so that can make its way over, right? So then you have an improper canonical there, or you have a canonical for the staging site, right? But the production URL is correct, so it's pointing to the wrong one. So again, another one where there's a variety of potential ways that can happen, but it's never good and sends the wrong signals to Google and users, depending on what they see.
Yep. Yeah, and another one is we see a lot of companies move to Webflow. Webflow is unique in that it has a global canonical setting in the like admin settings, and then they're also one that I think it's still the case, forces the www in the URL. And so when you have a company that's moving from a site-wide URL structure without the www to Webflow, maybe not totally catching that global canonical setting in one place, that can then kind of lead to that mismatch of the global canonical set to the non-www, but it's forcing the production URLs into the www version, and then it creates some issues there too.
Yep.
So issue number 5, 404 is being created from URL structure changes.
Yeah, I mean, it'll always happen. I mean, there's going to be potential with any site migration. They're usually paired with maybe some sort of redesign. It's not always just like a re-platform. So like maybe there's new pages being created with that migration to the new platform, right? So in that example, you're finding, hey, you have some solutions pages in a subfolder, or a lot of different subfolders being created or added, right? And things don't get redirected properly, or a lot of different ways that you can make 404s appear on a site migration. But that's like the worst thing. One of the worst things you want to happen is that ultimately a page that was there can no longer be found, and that causes a lot of the different issues. Obviously, downstream for performance it gets maybe removed from index. People bounce because they do find it. Kind of blows up things a little bit more than some of the others.
Yep. Cool. Nothing to add there.
Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, totally. Number 6, like page speed and site performance declines in maybe tracked versus in Core Web Vitals would be one place you might be seeing that.
Yeah, this is these are the most common. This is another common one with Core Web Vitals. The challenge with this and what we see is when the new website's built, right, whether it be like a whole new theme on WordPress or even a new build out on Webflow, these staging sites or environments get tested very isolated, right? So like you get page speed indicators that tell you that the site's really fast and it's hitting all these benchmarks and all that. But what's missing is that like field data that Google calls it, which would be more of a like user sourced assessment of the page speed and Core Web Vitals metrics. And so basically you get it perfect. We see devs get them perfect. We've seen them on the staging site. You crawl it, it's fine. All the metrics are passed, and then you launch it, and then you go to page speed insights or Lighthouse, and you see that they're not as good as you initially predicted or anticipated. So that one is something to always just kind of maybe anticipate it. You're going to see some sort of degradation no matter what when you have a migration, and plan accordingly to like jump on it, once the site goes live.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, number 7, metadata loss.
Yeah. This is, excuse me, we see this still all the time. Just meta, again, it can be from platform to new platform, but just classic meta descriptions, page titles that, and any other, image alt text, schema markup, even all that doesn't make its way over to the new website, which is actually really important when you have a really big site that you've maybe kind of crafted all of those and implemented thoughtfully and strategically over many years. And so like we'll commonly see you get into the crawl afterwards, and a bunch of page titles are gone, a bunch of meta descriptions are gone. And the reason that's important is just if you've deliberately crafted those and Google's picking up on them, it could have a major impact on your click-through rates. And if it's gone, Google's just going to go write their own and changes the game. It could have a major impact on overall what you're seeing from a performance standpoint. So as much as like people might not think metadata is a big deal, it does actually have a big impact if it's not handled well in a site migration.
Yeah, especially when you're talking about some of the schema markup, and again, a lot of it varies. If you have 25 pages on your website, then it's probably manageable, and like the breadth of the impact may not be as noticeable. But if you have like, a good 3,000-4,000 URLs or something like that, and you're changing stuff pretty broadly, then I think you can have quite a bit there. Number 8, we have broken images, but I'm going to expand it a little bit to broken images, images that are no longer compressed like they should be, and images that, new like templates within the CMS that don't have the same aspect ratio as your existing images, and like distort them or blow them out in some way.
Yep.
So just number 8, image issues in general, I guess we'll call it.
Yeah. I think it, that feeds into any image asset. It could be even a video embed or something that's not working right or formatted properly. I think it's pretty straightforward. Like it happened in terms of understanding the issue, but focusing, I guess, again on the impact is that like if all that stuff is, to your point around not compressed properly, page speed it takes a hit. Now ultimately, people might be bouncing. Google does have take a look at the bounce back to Google. So like if they're doing that because page speed or experience is impacted, you're maybe going to have a rankings hit and a lot of other things. So it might seem like a small thing. Oh, these images are broken. You can crawl, find out which ones are there, and then go replace them or get them updated. But ultimately, if you don't jump on them quickly, it can have a big impact on performance. And plus also like maybe you don't know what that file was because it wasn't labeled properly, right? And so now it's just harder to find the images. Yeah. So there's tons of weird nuances and quirks to that. But super important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that, there's some, especially when you think about some of the long form content that companies create, where you potentially have a number of screenshots, walking through something in detail, or it could be like integration type of stuff with your own content or knowledge base or whatever that that you're trying to kind of like spell out step by step. And so the entire post or article or whatever you have there becomes pretty much useless if the images have a big enough of an issue there.
Totally.
So it can definitely be a big factor. Number 9 is header tags like H1s, H2, H3s, and other content formatting gets messed up from the new design.
Yeah, this one we've encountered a few times more recently. And I think there's a lot of reasons why it happens, but ultimately to keep an eye out and anticipate is that, just the content doesn't make its way over to the new theme once the database for the content is like moved over, right, to support the new theme. Like if you can get everything into the staging environment and as prepped as best possibly can to make sure you cannot like visibly check it. But sometimes for some reason, when you make it over to production, just like tons of little things happen along the way, like formatting issues with between paragraphs, the spacing and things like that between headers, and like going back to the images somehow get reformatted. Really, really, really common, and not like the end of the world if ultimately all the content comes over, but it can add up to like a lot of like really tiny touch-ups and manual work that team members have to go back in and like reformat, especially if you have a ton of content. So it's really something to really kick the tires on in staging as much as possible before you actually make the migration.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the challenge is that each thing makes sense at its own stage, So like in your current CMS and design, just the way the fonts were programmed and whatever, like you just had to add that extra space at the end of a paragraph so that there's room, and it looks nice before the next H2. And then in the new design, someone's like, oh, we need to have padding above the H2s so that there's like room to breathe and it doesn't get crowded. And now all of a sudden that extra, line break after the paragraphs and all of your posts now creates this really big gap in between every paragraph and H2 on every single blog post. And you kind of have to go back through and hit backspace a lot of times in different places to make it all work. So it's a good point just to really kind of commit to combing through details and stuff in the staging process and really try to figure out as much as possible and just recognize that the way things are designed and then ultimately coded based on the design can have an impact on the content getting ported over. Number 10, sitemaps are not updated or are updated incorrectly.
Yeah. Ultimately an easier one to fix if like not done correctly, but a variety of scenarios in which, similar to some of the other ones, which is obviously something to look out for from staging to production, is ultimately like, URLs configured with the staging URL or anything. So like sitemaps might make their way over that are still the staging URL format, or again, URL formats or structure that's changed isn't like reflected into the sitemap. A lot of that stuff can usually get caught and fixed automatically with, like, if you're on WordPress, you have Yoast. Some of that stuff, if configured properly, like, will take care of itself, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have a specific instance of WordPress set up, or your Webflow configuration, which we ran into a few issues like that last year, where the sitemap was not being updated properly. And that site Webflow has a bunch of different scenarios in which your sitemap might not get updated because you have to republish the whole site or things like that. So there's just a lot of things to look out for. It's still a classic thing, sitemaps, but ultimately still important to make sure they're in top-notch shape.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, you can tell me if you disagree, but I think so many people, in the last 10 years have had at least some experience with using WordPress, and just the wide library of plugins available. And it's like you mentioned Yoast, and there's all kinds of different plugins to manage sitemaps. And so that's one area that, when you're moving to a headless CMS or Webflow or, a couple of others that might be the same, like that, you just have to pay attention to how sitemaps are going to be handled, how it's going to get ported over, because you might be used to, oh, it's easy. I have this plugin. I go, check these boxes, click this button, and I'm good to go. And that may not be the case. So really making sure you're kind of aware of that and getting that included with the devs in the sprints before, the project's over and they've moved on to other stuff and you're trying to scramble to get your sitemaps fixed.
Yep.
All right. And then number 11, the final one, any sort of JavaScript or tracking codes get lost or stop working.
Yeah. Last but not least, for sure. It's Still happens a lot where, for a variety of reasons, like the code just doesn't make its way over. The tag manager implementation is wrong or something, right? Which obviously has big repercussions for what performance looks like. Might not be that the site's not performing, but you think it isn't because you see all of a sudden your traffic and everything tanked for overnight. So that's one of the key things to look for, is just tracking codes are there and then working. And that's the last point on it, is ultimately that, like, you just got to make sure to test that it is implemented correctly and that there's not any issues with how it's firing ultimately at the end of the day, because there's a lot of things that can impact that, which we won't go into such detail here, but keep an eye out for it. Make sure it makes its way over. Otherwise, someone in the company might freak out that your website is losing all of its traffic, when it is kind of, but not really.
Yeah. You have a couple days or a couple weeks of no data, in analytics, or building a retargeting audience or whatever that might be. That all factors in. And I think the thing I would tack on there is just like the cookie consent and opting out process and all that, if that's changing at all with the new website, then just being mindful of how that's going to factor in, and even just potentially prepping folks for some potential loss in tracking data if you're like making a dramatic change in how you're handling cookie consent at that time. So I think, that's the big one overall. And I think the only thing that I feel like I want to add before we wrap up is just that most of the time when moving to, like, a lot of times you'll get excitement internally to move to a headless CMS. And there's, most often a developer that kind of does some research, gets excited, or does some page speed tests on the site and says, whoa, I can make this way faster. And I think the most important point to make there is totally fine, but just recognize that there are some headless CMS options that require a lot more prep on all of these factors to make sure that you have all the things in place to actually be able to make this search friendly, to have the schema, to have all these different things, to have the sitemaps. Like when it's not a native option there, you really have to kind of be on top of these different things and more, and really make sure that that's a part of the scope for the project and the developers to build that stuff in to the headless CMS to make sure that it's there for you as the marketer. So that would be my last thing that I wanted to add there. Anything you want to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, just there's, this is 11 things that we see commonly. There's, nearly limitless amount of things that can go wrong with a migration. And obviously you need to figure out a best system. This is a good place to start with, like, make the top priority things to like look out for, but just know that there's a lot that can go wrong if not fully thought out and planned. And even from the selection of the new platform that you might be migrating to, if that's one of the components of this. So just make sure, like anything, you just have a plan and a thoughtful strategy for how you're going to have the pre and post migration work done, and you should be good. It might not always be perfect, but you should be able to catch most issues and fix them relatively quickly.
Yeah. And make sure you crawl the site before, like, don't just crawl staging, crawl your site as it is before moving, so that you have something to be able to reference and look back and make the comparison and identify things in more detail if necessary. So, preparation is key. I think is probably the biggest thing. And hopefully, maybe a lot of these were common sense to you, but even if just one or two you weren't thinking about as you're either in the middle of this, in the thick of it, or if you've got this coming up in the near term, hopefully this will be helpful to you. So with that, we will wrap it up. Be sure to check out 10speed.io/podcast for all prior episodes. Like and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, wherever you prefer to listen. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
Yeah. Thanks, Nate.